Okay. Hello, everyone. Today I'll talk about Operation WordDrone, which is a cyber threat that we discovered last year and that focuses on the aerospace sector in Asia-Pacific region. But first, a bit about myself. My name is Ilia Dafchev, and I'm a security researcher at Attendees, where my main responsibilities are threat research, improving our detection capabilities of our EDR and antivirus product. Previously, I worked as a security analyst, where I specialized in digital forensics and incident response. So why WordDrone? What's the common thing between Word and drones? You might, when you see Word, maybe you think it's yet another malicious macro, but you'd be wrong. The following slides, I hope the connection will become clear. So let's go to the story of discovery. Last year, June 26th, we received a ticket escalation from one of our partners. And here I want to just explain that our customers are usually service providers who provide our product to their own customers. So we don't immediately know who the end user is. They basically asked us that they had EDR alert for Microsoft Word and wanted some help to understand what actually was happening. We agreed to help them and asked for any data, screenshot or whatever they had that could help us analyze the incident. They sent us a screenshot, and this is what the first evidence of what later we will call WordDrone. Do you see anything suspicious here? Maybe you immediately see that Word is launching command prompt. And in turn, it also executes net.exe and some other commands. Other suspicious indicators, of course, the process was stopped. Word running as the system account, the highest account on Windows. It had a suspicious argument. If you search for that SVC load on Google, you'll find that Word does not support this argument. It executed from a directory where Word is not usually installed. And if you check the hash, it's a legitimate Microsoft Word, but a very ancient version. And what was also suspicious here was that the client already used a quite recent version, so it didn't make sense for them to have the two different versions on the host. Given all those red flags, we told them that we want to investigate further. We started our investigation, and here I want to point out that this investigation is from us as an EDR vendor. It was not an incident response. Customer handled that internally. So our investigation started by reviewing our telemetry around when the incident happened. What we found was that there was a double-lib DLL in the same folder where that WinWord was located. The DLL was in the memory space of WinWord. The hash was not publicly known. If it was a legitimate Microsoft library, there's a high chance you'll find it at least uploaded somewhere. And there were indicators that potentially a shellcode was running inside this WinWord executable. Also, WinWord was running as a service, which explains why it was executing with the system account. After that, we collected telemetry for a larger period of time, I think 3 months. And we noticed that the incidents started happening more than a month prior to the ticket escalation. Some were closed as false positives. And some executables in those that were part of the incident were added as exclusions by the customer, and he confirmed that he added those. For example, like process dump, which was used to dump LCSS process memory in order to gather credentials. Reviewing telemetry, we gathered all the paths where WinWord was located, and all of them had this SVC load argument. And most of them tried to use directories that belong to Microsoft or Office, with the exclusion of the first one with pod player and the bottom one, which the path belonged to an ERP product. And this update.exe is a legitimate component of this ERP product, but in this case it was just renamed WinWord. Some of the other commands that were executed, of course, process dump, that I already said, and it was blocked, but after the customer excluded those, the next attempts were successful, and of course, most likely attackers were able to gather credentials. Attackers also tried to dump the system hives, the registry hives, in order, again, to access credentials. Some other tools that were used was an attempted use of TrueSight Killer, which is a known EDR killer that uses a vulnerable driver. Sharp RDP log, which was unknown to me at that time, and more that on the next slide. For lateral movement, attackers use WMI exec, and several commands we gathered that were where the parents of those commands were WinWord or DOL host. Task list, task queue, ipconfig, net, ping, nestat, wmc, wmi, the usual commands you might see when the attacker tries to understand the system. Regarding sharp RDP log, it turned out that it's just a simple user enumeration tool that enumerates the user accounts which either successfully or failed to log in with RDP in the past. And it had very simple options. Because telemetry provides just limited information of what happened, we asked if the customer could provide us with host-based artifacts, like files that we observed, logs, and disk images that we would analyze forensically. In each folder where WinWord was located, we found, of course, the WWLib that we already saw in telemetry, WinWord itself, and one randomly named file. There were 3 different DLLs, like 3 different hashes, and 3 different random files. 2 of the DLLs were validly signed, and none were publicly known. So at this point, we asked ourselves what is known about this WWLib, what actually it is. When we searched for it, we found that there was a known side-loading vulnerability in Microsoft Word, some versions of Microsoft Word, and predominantly it was abused by threats like Valirat, Luminous Moth, Mustang Panda. At least those were the most frequent articles that came up. When we checked the code of the DLL and compared it to the ones in those cases, we noticed that it is something new, that it looked very different. It was something new that nobody else had written about yet. This meant that either this is a very new threat, still not widely spread, or very targeted, or both, new and targeted. So this made us ask ourselves who was actually the victim. As I said earlier, we don't immediately know who the end user is. It turned out it is a Taiwanese manufacturer of aerospace components and drones, which made things a bit more interesting. We continued to invest to try to determine how initial compromise happened. Unfortunately, because it happened more than a month ago, the host-based artifacts were not that useful. Logs have rotated. Registry timestamps were not that useful anymore, etc. Telemetry gives a limited view of what actually happens. And regarding this update.exe that we saw earlier, this is the first alert ever detected at the victim. So this update.exe, as I said, was a legitimate component of the ERP product. It's responsible for regularly checking for updates. So attackers maybe managed to replace it with WinWord executable, and on the next update check, it will get executed and infection chain would start. There were recent vulnerabilities around the time when our investigation was running in this exact ERP product, some of them with very high severity. The vulnerabilities were regarding a component in the ERP product. I don't know if it was used in the ERP product, but it was an interesting observation. And later in August, there was also an arbitrary file download in the same component of that ERP product. So we don't have enough data, and our hypothesis at this time is either an exploit in the ERP product or exploit in another service, probably in the system, and which would allow attackers to replace update.exe component, or a supply chain attack. This is a summary of the detections. Not all of them are shown. But first detection happened early May at the client with the update.exe. Some recon commands were executed, attempted TrueSite killer, attempted process dump. Another location was tried for WinWord, and 2 days later, process dump was excluded by the customer. On 16th, there was another detection for WinWord. They tried again with the TrueSite killer. They tried twice process dump. At least one was successful because of the exclusion. They tried 2 times for the dumping registry hive and sharp RDP log. The next interesting detection was on 20th of June, so on one month past. They used this time, for some reason, the bot layer path. On the next day, there was detection on an ERP DB and backup server the detection was related to WMI exec 2 and execution under program files. 5 days later, customer raised the ticket and our investigation started. At this point, I also want to say that we didn't have complete visibility in the environment because customer used 2 security products. So some of them were, some of the hosts probably had 1 product and some ours. So our view was partial in the environment and we were not involved in the incident response process. Now, let's delve into the internals of WordDrone. As I said, it starts with sideloading in WinWord, with sideloads www.dol. This DOL was a 32-bit DOL compiled maybe 1 week before the first detection. It didn't have any exports. All functionality was in the DOL main function. 2 of those were signed validly with a certificate that belonged to a company producing industrial embedded systems. and it was also located in the Asia-Pacific region. And it was valid. Those are in the timestamps are in a US format, so they were valid at least at the beginning of the attack, and after that, the next iterations of WWLib were no longer signed when this certificate expired. WWLib uses fibers instead of threads and has a check for the host process, the process which loaded the DLL. It checks the entry point RVA for that process and compares it with this hard-coded value. The result, if the recall would be 0 because of the XOR operation, will be saved in EDX. This result will later be used in other calculations. So if it's different than 0, the program will crash if they're not equal. So by this way, it makes sure it is loaded only by WinWord process. For example, here, EDX is used as an offset. If it is anything different than 0, it will modify a different field in the fiber structure than what was intended. And it originally intends to modify the pointer to the function which the fiber would execute, which originally is configured to execute a wrapper to message box A. But after this modification of the undocumented fiber structure, it will execute, continue with the malicious part of the code. The loader is fairly simple. It loads the randomly named file we saw earlier from disk, performs another check for the entry point. If all is good, it uses the size of the encrypted file on disk, its own size as a key. And with a basic XOR operation, the decryption decrypts the contents. The execution is also very simple. It pushes the pointer of the decrypted buffer on stack and returns, which effectively transfers execution to the next stage. The next stage is a simple shellcode loader. Uses API hashing and RT with the compressed buffer to decompress the next stage, which reflectively self-injects another DLL and calls its export install setup. So the next stage is another DLL, install DLL, with install setup exported function, which is responsible for persistence. It has a hard-coded configuration and supports 3 actions. It can create a service, create a task, or self-inject. In our case, it was configured as a service, and below the flag which specified which action to take, you can see the service configuration, like the service name, the service display name, and the service description. But let's look at each action individually. Process injection, it supports 2 targets. It can inject either in itself, in this case WinWord, or inject in SVC host using the following arguments. The injection is again a reflective DOM injection. And the next stage has an export DR setup that gets called. The loader shellcode is being called with the undocumented NT create threadx function. The service creation, which was our case, started by checking if SVC load argument is in the command line. If it is, it registers a service with the current path and command line and appends the SVC load to the end of the command line. If registration fails for some reason, it calls inject process and just injects into itself and continues execution. If SVC load is found, it performs validation to check if the process is indeed started as a service. If all is good, that it has SVC load in the argument, it is running as a service, then it injects the next stage into itself By this, it makes sure it is running with system-level privileges. Task creation. It is similar to the service creation, but uses task load as an argument and common object model for the task creation. Client endpoint DLL is the main component of WordDrone, where its main logic is used. It starts execution with anti-DLL on hooking using blindside technique. This technique it creates a new process in a debugged state and places a hardware breakpoint on loader load DLL function. When that breakpoint is hit in the remote process, this makes sure that only anti-DLL is loaded at that time. So no other user mode libraries like hooking libraries are in the process. After that, the malicious process copies the text section of that clean anti-DLL into its own anti-DLL, effectively removing any user mode hooks. On this slide, I just want to show that the attackers basically copy-pasted the code from GitHub. The steps in the code are exactly in the same order, the same loops, etc. After this, the anti-DLL hooking, it also used EDR silencer. It was again compiled into the binary. And again, the code was basically copy-pasted with minor modifications by removing printfs and some other small things, but basically it was the same. Even the order of the security products, which EDR targets, EDR silencer targets, is exactly the same. And if anyone doesn't know, EDR silencer is a tool which blocks network communication of the hard-coded EDR processes, so they can't send alerts to their EDR console. Client endpoint also has hard-coded configuration, which is quite large. I haven't reversed it fully, only a small part of it, but there it supports. It defines what module to run. It supports two main modules, client module and server module. Both can be enabled, only one could be enabled. In our case, only client module was enabled. And most of my analysis is on that one. So I'll briefly mention the small thing I know about server module, because I haven't analyzed it that much. Is that, as the name suggests, it starts working as a server, listening on some port, and supports accepting communications from several protocols like SMB, HTTP, TLS, etc. My hypothesis for it is that it is used as a proxy. So when other infected clients are configured to communicate to the one that is configured as a server, the server one will send the communication to the command control. That way, communication happens only through one infected host, and you don't see communication from every infected host to the outside. So client module, it starts by checking the current time. It takes the current hour and compares it to an array with flags, which represent each hour in the week. If the flag is 1, then network communication is allowed. Otherwise, it sleeps. In this way, attackers can specify very precisely at what time they want to communicate, to allow communication to the command and control. In our case, it was allowed all the time. Regarding network communication, it supports several protocols, but it uses them as transport. And above them, it transports its own custom protocol. The supported protocols are TCP, SMB, TLS, HTTP, HTTPS, and WebSocket, which, as you can see from the screenshot, in our case, WebSocket was used as transport. The frame of the custom protocol starts with 2 random bytes in the header and 3 fields which were XOR encrypted. The first field is the action code, which is the action which the command and control server asks from the client to execute. Result code is the result which the client will respond. If the action was successful, it will send 0 or some error code otherwise. Target hash is a custom hash that is calculated over the host name and the username, which allowed the attackers to specify not only on what host to execute the given command, but also as what user. And in the end is the payload, which is AS counter encrypted and zlib compressed. The payload itself had its own format, which differed for each action code. Although it was not obfuscated, it was hard to understand completely all the functionality of the action codes. I haven't mentioned it before, but it's written in C++, so a lot of objects, a lot of VF tables, a lot of indirect calls happen, so it's statically it's very hard to follow the logic. So you have to do it dynamically. But to do it dynamically, you need an active C2 server, but in our case, it was not longer active or it was geofenced. So the first step was to write a C2 emulation script, start debugging, and send, for example, command 1, and follow the execution flow to see what happens. And you take, for example, in this case, the error handling branch, because some byte in the payload was wrong. It is a binary protocol, so it's not like you can compare strings, for example, execute command X and take that branch. Then send command 1 again with proper content, but again take wrong path because somewhere there was another wrong byte in the payload. So repeat this until the meaning of all bytes and their meaning is figured out in the payload. Then proceed with command 2. Again error because it expects a different format. So you repeat this process for the rest of the 50 commands. And you can see that even though it's not obfuscated, it's very time-consuming without having a recording of the C2 traffic, as you have to understand the meaning of each byte in the payload, which is not immediately clear in the code. Some of the action codes that I was able to figure out were number 2 in hex, which just collects basic user and operating system information and sends it to the command and control. Injecting another DLL into DLL host. If you remember, previously DLL host was the parent of some of the commands. 7 just basically ping. The C2 server pings the client. It will send back the exact same data the C2 sent. 15 executes shellcode. 24 changes the operation to server mode, so it starts listening on some port and supports almost the same protocols. The difference that here it supports UDP and previously the server module in the beginning didn't support UDP. 26 makes the client to connect to another infected host that is configured as a server. Link Manager is a module which implements this functionality. At the top you can see action code and then a switch statement which handles which branch to take depending on the action code. Left function sets the operation to server mode. The right function makes it connect to some address. The server function had some string that indicated that when SMB is used, maybe it uses some local SMB tunnel. I haven't analyzed the full functionality. Otherwise, if another protocol is used, it just tells that it's listening on some port. And above are just some of the supported protocols. Session Manager is another module which, when executed, it enumerates each session on the host, each user session on the host. For each session, it enumerates processes in that session, finds Explorer exe in that user session, and copies the user token of that Explorer exe. Then creates the DLL host process in suspended state with that user token. Basically, prepares for injection, and again, reflectively injects this session server DLL into DLL host and calls the SSStart exported function. Communication between client endpoint and session server happens through named pipes, and the name of the pipe has the session ID of the user. So this session server is injected into each user session on the host, and it supports subset of the commands of client endpoint. So when a command is sent from the command and control to be executed, a specific user, it gets sent to the session server, and it executes it as the said user in its own session. This is summary of the infection chain. So Winward sideloads www.lib. www.lib loads the encrypted payload from disk, calls the next stage shellcode, which then self-injects install DLL, which then starts service, and if it starts successfully as a service, in our case, it injects client endpoint, which starts communicating with the command and control. If certain command is sent, then it also injects session server into each user session and communicates through named pipes. While the investigation took place, we also hunted for new samples in our telemetry, but also set up hunting rules in VirusTotal. In VirusTotal, you can set YARA rules, so when someone uploads a sample that matches your rule, you get notified. And this is the timeline from where we saw samples being uploaded. The country of origin from where the sample is uploaded does not mean that there was a victim there. It could have been maybe a security company that worked with someone in that region, and they uploaded it from their own country. So in April, there was an upload in Taiwan, from Taiwan. This was a sample that we haven't seen in our case. Then in July, there was an upload from Canada. That's one of the samples we had in this case. Then again in July, an upload from US. This was a new sample. And they basically differed, the new samples here differed mainly in their configuration. In August, there's an upload again from Taiwan. This was one that we already seen in our case. In September, we published a blog with our findings. There was an upload from China with test.txt, probably testing detection, I don't know. Then in October, there's an upload again from Taiwan. In November, it was from South Korea, but this was interesting that it was the next stage payload. It was installed DLL, and it looked like it was dumped from memory. So someone was probably investigating another incident, dumped it from memory, and uploaded it to VirusTotal. And this sample was different than what we had. It had some new functionality in it. January this year, there was an upload from Singapore. And just last month, there was another upload from South Korea, which is almost the same with the one from November. It was again installed DLL, again dumped from memory, and had some new functionality. So regarding what's new in those two samples, they didn't have EDR silencer no more. The target hash was changed to now also include the GeoID path of the C drive. And the server module now used WinDivert driver. WinDivert is a network driver, open source network driver, with which you can capture packets, sniff network packets, drop, inject, modify, whatever you want. I didn't have time to fully understand how it is used, but it is used in the server module, so maybe somehow it aids the C2 communication. Or maybe hides the port on which it listens. I don't really know. Some additional investigation was for the C2 servers. They were behind Cloudflare, but using historical DNS records, we were able to find the actual IP behind Cloudflare. All of them were hosted in the target country, in this case, Taiwan. And they, according to Shodan, they had Ubuntu running with an OpenSSH port. The WinDivert driver was signed again by a company in that Asia-Pacific region. And interestingly, it was a security company. It was an interesting observation. And that was it from me. Thank you. If you want, you can connect with me. The QR codes are safe.